Okay, welcome everybody to this beautiful lunch session. We are going to talk today about climate resilient urban sanitation. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Katrin Prüber. I'm working for the Resilient Cities Network as Global Director Programs, and I have the pleasure today to facilitate the conversation. You see on the screen, we are going to use the Mentimeter today. So please get ready if you want to share some insights and answers with us. You can either use the link and the code provided on the screen, or and now I don't even know how you call this square thingy. You know how to use that with your camera and your smartphone most probably. So exactly. Thank you, Alex. The QR code, that was the prompt I needed. And I'm going to ask my colleague Luciana to actually let us start with our first question of today. Or maybe not. Yes. So why are you actually going to spend your lunch break with us? Give us an indication why we have the pleasure to meet you today. Thank you. Apparently, we only have we only have 2 participants who want to share with us so far. I think the best answers we were able to get: 1 poo enthusiast, 2 poo enthusiasts, another person who cannot imagine to not talk about sanitation. I think you are in the right group of people here. I guess everybody who's going to speak today is in the same club. Thank you so much. I'm taking that as a compliment for Mintje and Jens today, because of the awesome speakers. Thanks a lot. Don't put any pressure on us. Only four answers. There's a 5th one. Thank you. Okay, not too much pressure on us, please. We don't have more poo enthusiasts in this group of people listening to us today. I'm really disappointed. Yes, that's what I wanted to say. Anyway, we have a lot in front of us. So it seems at least we have nearly, let's say we have 60, more than 70% either joining us today because they are super crazy about sanitation. Another couple of people who are excited to see us. That's great. Now we have a balanced perspective, and let's start. Mintje, I'm handing over to you. I know that we agreed that I would do the introduction. I'm going to change that now. Please, the floor is yours. So now we can't hear you. Now we can hear you.
Now it works. Yeah, I'm somehow a participant, and it says participants are not allowed to unmute themselves. So that's a very interesting part when I'm trying to speak. Yes, but now you can hear me, and I think it's quite fine to do the introduction with this presentation, actually, Katrin. Because we want to talk about, well, okay, first of all, my name is Mintje Burma. I'm working for GIZ in Bonn in Germany, in GIZ headquarters for a sustainable sanitation program with a focus on sanitation and climate. So that's why I'm here today to present you about climate resilient urban sanitation. On the next slide, please. I want to start with a quote from our Director for Global Health, Pandemic Prevention and One Health at the BMZ, our ministry. Taking climate change and possible future pandemics, investments in resilient sanitation systems can safeguard public health. And so on the next slide, I want to ask the question, so what is urban resilience? Simply put, it's the capacity of urban systems to survive, adapt, and grow when faced with chronic stresses and acute shocks. And when the resilience of cities is considered, however, sanitation is often overlooked. For instance, in the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, sanitation is not mentioned specifically. As part of critical infrastructure, only water is mentioned. So against this backdrop, GIZ, in collaboration with our cities, commissioned a publication to focus on climate resilient urban sanitation. And at this point, I also saw that Leonie Hyde-Smith is actually one of the participants who was one of the authors of this report. So I really want to thank Agua Consult for putting this report together. Yes, so on the next slide, I don't think I have to explain to the group of people here at UNC that sanitation is important and that we by far have not reached the sanitation goals. I just want to re-emphasize that when we talk about a sanitation system today in this presentation and also in our study, we are referring to not only the sanitation chain that you see at the bottom, but also to other factors that are in place to ensure sustained access to safely managed sanitation services, such as also the planning aspects, financing aspects, regulations, and so on. So when we consider the impact of climate change on urban sanitation systems, we don't only look at the impact it has on the infrastructure part and the services, but also on the enabling environment around it, at the capacity of actors, at their interrelationships. So on the next slide, I am just presenting you the 4 main direct climate-related shocks and stresses on sanitation systems that were identified in the study. And these, of course, also vary according to the different locations. So we have extreme heat, we have water scarcity and drought, we have increased precipitation, flooding, and extreme weather, and we have rising sea levels. And on the next slide, I'm going to give you some more examples. A lot of studies have looked at climate-related positive and negative impacts on sanitation infrastructure. For example, extreme heat can lead to increased corrosion of sewer networks, or another example that the negative impact of rising sea levels has on infrastructure and also on treatment processes due to saltwater intrusion, for example. So those are just 2 examples that I will pick out of this extensive list that I'm presenting you here. But an important point is that there is little information so far on the impacts on the enabling environment. So we in this study also wanted to highlight that. So for example, the negative impact that flooding events have on household expenditure due to increased maintenance, or also increased heat stress of sanitation workers during extreme heat events. So that's just picking 2 examples. On the next slide, I'll show you the 4 case studies that we looked at in our study from 4 cities, from Santa Cruz in Bolivia, from Chennai in India, Lusaka in Zambia, and Cape Town in South Africa. And here also, we want to thank again the stakeholders that were involved from these cities and provided their input, because otherwise it would not have been possible to get such vast collections of details. So looking into these 4 studies and looking on the next slide into the demand for climate resilient urban sanitation in these 4 cities, it was seen that tangible impacts from chronic stresses and acute shocks, such as a loss of life or an economic impacts, play a critical role in the demand for climate resilient services, even though forecasts and assessments highlighted vulnerabilities before severe flooding and water scarcity challenges, for example, in Chennai and Cape Town. it was only after the acute shocks that the stakeholders really took concerted action. So that was an important finding, that investments are indirectly strengthening climate resilience of sanitation services, but these investments are generally not really driven by the core objective of increasing climate resilience, but they are rather driven by the desire to ensure reliable water supply, for example, or also sanitation services in general. On the next slide, I want to share with you an example from adapting to water scarcity and drought from the cities. So the adaptations here primarily focus on ensuring reliable water supply services through diversifying and enhancing water sources or reducing water usage. And these are indirectly strengthening the resilience of sanitation systems. But however, there have also been notable adaptations made across the sanitation chain to increase climate resilience that include, for example, wastewater recycling or flexible wastewater treatment plants that can withstand low flow conditions that occur under water scarcity events, or also modifications to household sanitation facilities, such as reduced water consumption. On the next slide, I will give you an example of adaptation to flooding and extreme weather events. There have been several adaptations directly increasing climate resilience to flooding or extreme weather events. For example, in the case study of Lusaka, on-site sanitation technologies have been designed and constructed to increase resilience to flooding. Or also the use of decentralized wastewater treatment systems, as they seem to increase flexibility by reducing dependencies on large wastewater treatment plants that are often impacted by flooding. So those are just some examples from the study. On the next slide, I just want to go into 3 gaps that are highlighted from the study. The first one is that urban sanitation resilience depends on complex relationships and on interdependencies of mandates, services, and infrastructure. And the current discourse around sanitation, resilience, and adaptation is focused yet on technology, with the prevalence of silo thinking and a fragmentation of institutions and service chains. The second point is that there are no globally accepted definitions or metrics or measurable outcomes or indicators that allow for a monitoring of climate resilient urban sanitation. And the third point is that there are already substantial gaps in financing the achieving of SDG 6 targets by 2030. And so investing in climate resilient urban sanitation has become a secondary priority and a significant gap also for governments to invest in. Also, there is no available data on the global cost of increasing climate resilient urban sanitation, but also there is no cost shown on a do-nothing approach. So what will happen if we don't invest in climate resilient urban sanitation systems? On the other hand, there are also some key opportunities. Just to highlight one, that of course also accessing additional financing for climate resilient urban sanitation could be done from climate specific funds, or also looking through the potential of climate mitigation as a co-benefit of resilience. So with that, I want to introduce you, a framework for climate resilient urban sanitation that we are suggesting. The framework is based on the structure of the City Water Resilience Framework and has been adapted for sanitation. And the framework describes specifically climate resilience of urban sanitation, but also acknowledges the interconnectivity and the interdependence of urban infrastructure and its service system. A cross-cutting theme through all the dimensions and goals is a vulnerability-led perspective. So it puts communities and people and their existing and future livelihoods in the center. I'm just going to highlight an example from it, which is the first dimension of leadership and strategy, and it's the goal coordinated governance. And it's especially important to facilitate coordination and preparedness for and during extreme weather events. Another example from the second part of planning and finance is the point that urban sanitation regulation can either be an enabler or it can also be a hindrance for improved climate resilience. So when we look at well-targeted and enforced regulation, it can, for example, protect sanitation users from poorly designed and poorly maintained infrastructure that leads to parts of the sanitation system become ineffective or also fail during climate-related shocks. Or it could also support users from overcharging for repair and maintenance, for example, during a flooding event. I'm not going to go into details into all the other points. I think we will also share the study with you so you can have a closer look at the other points of the framework. So just to close in the next slide. So why is climate resilience in urban sanitation important? Climate change is likely to exacerbate current inequalities in urban sanitation, and quantifying a do-nothing scenario is critical, as the progress that has been made towards achieving SDG 6 is highly likely to be lost if we don't invest in resilience in the current sanitation systems. Also, there is no blueprint for achieving climate resilience for urban sanitation, and resilience is not an end state, it's a journey. So adapting sanitation infrastructure, it's only one piece of the puzzle. And moving forwards, we need to really start looking at climate resilient sanitation, not only from a risk perspective, but also from the opportunities that improvements could bring for a city. So, for example, also addressing other vulnerabilities such as poverty, housing, or water scarcity. And with these three conclusions, I think that's the last slide, I will end my very brief and quick presentation of the topic, an introduction to the topic, and I'll hand back to Katrin. I think now Katrin is not able to unmute herself. I might just leave my microphone on.
Yes, so I got permission to speak. Thank you so much, Mintje. And just quickly, I have no idea how we are going to see if the audience has any questions, because apparently the audience is listening to us on a different platform than we are talking on. So I apologize for that. However, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat in whatever platform you're currently looking at us, and we will try. There's a okay, apparently there is some information, but I can't see that at the moment. So Alex, please help us. So anyway, if you have any comments, any questions, please put them in the chat. We will make sure that we will be able to respond to them. I apologize for this clinch. I haven't sorted out the technology apparently right on my side. So so apologies for that. We have another question here before I am going to give the floor to Jens, who will talk about climate and sanitation in the context of a specific city example. So we would like to hear we would like to understand whom you are working for. I hope that by now, looking at the participants, we have 43 poo enthusiasts here. Unfortunately, we're not going to ask the question. So give us an indication who you're working for, or why you're here, so that we can understand what you're interested in, and also understand if you most probably know a lot more about the stuff we are talking about today. So we have at least 2 pool enthusiasts that sometimes gain money from being pool enthusiasts. That is totally amazing. I would like to learn how you're doing that, because I actually haven't figured out how to make money just with toilets, which I would be excited to do. We have a number of researchers. This is great because you most probably will see that our study is not academic research. So please comment and rip us apart if you have questions. And we have at least one person from an NGO like me. Thank you so much for joining us, 2 people. So I guess, Jens, looking at this screen, I'm handing over to you for the city example. Be aware that we have a lot of scientists in this conversation, so be careful what you're saying. But we are looking forward to actually have and hear a truly practitioner's view, which I think is definitely something to get an applause for if we could do that, because you're implementing what we are talking about, and the floor is yours. Or maybe not.
Now it is.
Now it is. And if you could quickly say who you are and who you're working for, that would be great. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Katrin. Yeah, hi to everyone. My name is Jens Götzenberger. I'm an environmental engineer and currently project manager of a program for sustainable drinking water and sanitation services in peri-urban areas in Bolivia. I am sitting in La Paz, but I want to present now the case study of Santa Cruz de la Sierra in Bolivia, which was part of the study that Mintje just mentioned. I'm not sure whether you can see my presentation already.
Yes, we can.
Oh yeah, okay, great. Still?
Not anymore.
Oh yeah. What I thought. Now you should be. Yes, so I want to talk about resilience to sanitation in the city of Santa Cruz, Bolivia. So first, some general information about Santa Cruz. It's in Bolivia, there are 9 departments, out of which Santa Cruz is the biggest one in terms of surface area. And the capital city of Santa Cruz is Santa Cruz de la Sierra. It's a city located at the Piraí River, and it's located in the eastern tropical lowlands of Bolivia, located at 400 meters above sea level. Santa Cruz, it's not the capital, but it's the economic hub of Bolivia, and at the same time, the biggest city with 1.9 million people and 2.3 million people in its metropolitan area. And in Santa Cruz, there's a huge urbanization of currently 6% annual growth rate per year. As I mentioned, it's located in the tropics, so there's a tropical climate with a precipitation between 40 and 200 millimeters per month, and a total annual precipitation of 1,300 meters. So it's a pretty rainy area, and that's also the problem. Flooding and high-intensity rainfalls are the main climate change shocks impacting Santa Cruz. Let's have a look on the sanitation situation. Approximately 70% of the urban population has access to safely managed sanitation. And out of that, 53% have an access to a sewer system. And in the unsewered areas, septic tanks and poor flush toilets are the most common sanitation solutions, with 21 and 23% respectively, and 3% of the population have to practice open defecation. According to the Metropolitan Master Plan, the city intends to increase sewer coverage to 100% by 2026. However, this seems very challenging, and yeah, we have to see whether this works. Hopefully, yes. At the moment, 30% of the wastewater and fecal sludge are not effectively treated, and this results in environmental pollution and especially groundwater pollution. That's a big issue for Santa Cruz because the aquifer, it's the city's only water source, hence groundwater protection and from wastewater and fecal sludge is essential for public health. Mintje already mentioned that we can distinguish between acute shocks and chronic shocks related to climate change and its impacts on sanitation. So on this slide, I want to present the acute shock. So there's direct negative impacts on climate, on sanitation resilience, which is due to rapid onset flooding, which is leading or resulting in flooding of septic tanks and poor flush latrines mainly, and eventually also the collapse of wastewater lagoons, which are the main wastewater treatment technologies in Bolivia. And indirect negative impacts due to acute shocks are different environmental hazards and public health hazards, especially due to groundwater pollution and the spread of waterborne diseases. If we look into the chronic stresses, direct impacts are the stresses are the recurrent flooding that I mentioned. There are 2 to 3 significant floods per year. And indirect impacts of the chronic stress is the water scarcity through deteriorating water quality, which is based on poorly managed on-site sanitation systems and fecal sludge and wastewater not being treated properly. What I mentioned before, 30% of fecal sludge and wastewater is not treated at the moment. Another reason for this water scarcity is the reduced percolation for recharge of aquifers. This has also different reasons. One is the high intensity rainfalls in combination with a limited infiltration capacity of the soil. Another reason is the intense deforestation of the catchment area. Also, much of it is declared or designated as protection zones. And finally, another reason for the water scarcity is the reduction in permeable surfaces due to the rapid urbanization that I have mentioned previously. So before we have a look on how to increase climate resilience on a local level in Santa Cruz, I would like to show you a little bit the frame on national level. The Ministry of Environment and Water is currently preparing the National Wastewater Treatment Strategy, which will be like the umbrella about what's going to be implemented on local level. So checking the policy, it's obvious that the strategy acknowledged the need for focusing on the development of climate resilient sanitation systems. And looking through the strategy, it comes out that the strategy highlights clearly a demand for measures to adapt to the risk of climate change. It targets aspects of resilience to climate change in the services of water utilities on local level. It demands for strategic decision-making based on climate change scenarios. The strategy also highlights the need for risk prevention and mitigation measures related to climate change. And it promotes the development of technological innovations for wastewater treatment that contribute to byproduct recovery and consider climate change adaptations. And finally, the strategy also wants to promote safe reuse of treated wastewater as a strategic measure for adapting to climate change. So checking the strategy, in short, we can say that it is aware of the need to build climate resilient sanitation services, but the question remains how to implement that on local level, for instance, in Santa Cruz, considering the given conditions related to human and financial resources, political priorities on local level, etc. Okay, now let's look finally into the case of Santa Cruz de la Sierra. The demand for adaptation responses is mainly related to the chronic stress of limited availability of affordable and safe water, what I mentioned before. And this water scarcity has also a negative impact on the existing sewer system. For instance, now if we think about the self-cleansing velocity inside the sewers, if there's not enough water. But the biggest demand for investments in climate resilient sanitation is related to reduction of groundwater pollution from collapsed on-site sanitation systems during flooding. Sorry. So the local government and the water utilities in Santa Cruz are aware of the need for additional water sources, but a holistic climate change adaptation strategy does not yet exist. Okay, now I would like to present a little bit what is going to be implemented or what is implemented at the moment in terms of increasing climate resilient sanitation systems with support of GIZ, little bit the activities that we are doing or planning to do in the project that I'm running. So we support integrating resilience and climate change into planning, decision making, and monitoring on local level. So for instance, we support our counterparts in creating or reactivating stakeholder committees to identify measures to increase resilience. And part of these committees are, for instance, sector players, obviously, but also local governments, the municipalities, the private sector, and also academia. We also support the actors in integrating sector policies into urban planning, which is really key to increase resilience on local level. So we sit with the municipalities, with the departmental governments to integrate sanitation or climate resilient sanitation currently in the preparation of their 5-year plans. We also at the moment run some analysis or baseline surveys to identify weaknesses of the sanitation chain, which might be or which are on political, administrative, technical, financial, and social levels. We currently have some experts on board that do some climate scenarios as basis for urban planning in terms of sanitation. So this will help the municipalities to develop, for instance, infrastructure projects or define groundwater protection zones, or also to create local norms and guidelines. Later on, we will support the local governments in the planning and implementing the selected measures, which could be, for instance, decentralized sanitation systems, fecal sludge management, or wastewater reuse. And we support local and national governments in the preparation of guidelines and norms. At the moment, we are, for example, preparing a guideline about the treatment of landfill leachate, which is also a big concern in terms of groundwater pollution due to its very high concentration or pollutant concentrations. Yeah, we also work with our counterparts to optimize mechanisms for monitoring of the effluents of wastewater treatment plants and treated wastewater through automation. We supply laboratories with equipment, and we do training with staff of the laboratories. We are working on improving data management and decision making at different territorial scales on municipal level, departmental, or metropolitan level. And we also work with our counterparts on applying the principle of digital resilience by creating data interoperability between national and local levels to provide access to information to decision makers, professionals, and the public, with the purpose of being able to prioritize actions based on technical knowledge. And finally, we are currently working with the counterparts on generate resilience with the introduction of early warning systems related to wastewater to identify viral outbreaks at the moment, but in future, these systems can also be used to identify other types of contamination related to public health and environmental protection. So at the moment, we are piloting an early warning system related to the detection of the SARS-CoV-2 virus in wastewater, but in future, this system can also be elaborated further to identify other pollutions. That's it about Santa Cruz, Sanitation Santa Cruz. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hand back to Katrin.
Thank you so much, Jens, for the presentation. So by now we have realized that there are already a number of questions in the chat. So we are going to start trying to answer these. please bear with me while we're trying to do that. We also have a few more questions to you. And I'm trying to work my way now from the bottom up, because there have been like two questions which are directly linked to the why urban, why cities, and not not rural areas, and how we perceive, or how, if there should be a differentiation between rural and urban sanitation. And before I give the word to Mintje and Jens, I would like to comment on that question and the reason why I'm sitting in this conversation here today. So if you go back to the presentation of Mintje, is that the study was commissioned by my organization and GIZ. I'm working for a cities network. And the reason why we looked at the interlinkage between urban sanitation and climate change was that we understand, in the context of building urban resilience with cities around the world, that the sanitation systems are critical to build resilience in cities. So we never had the intention to look at rural areas in that sense, because we recognize that there's a massive problem in cities if sanitation systems are not functioning. And that not only means for people and the way they use or do not use or have access or do not have access to this critical service, but how sanitation or the lack thereof impacts a city and the functioning of a city as a whole. As the focus in that sense was on cities, and the reason why cities and climate change is pretty obvious. Cities, a lot of people live in cities. If we look forward towards 2050, we will have between 60 to 75% of the global population living in cities. They live in very dense environments. So if something happens, or if climate change impacts, a lot of people are affected. So we were looking specifically at that context and not at the rural context. When we're talking about urban resilience or resilience in general within cities, there's a lot about risks and damages. So if you look at the last 10 years, how much damage has been done by climate-induced shocks and stresses, and a lot of the shocks and stresses that are experienced in cities are climate-related, or at least water-related. You can see that if we are talking about damage in people, like people dying and people dying and economic losses, the impact climate change has on cities is much more pronounced on a smaller place if something happens. And having said that, I would quickly also like to turn to one question. So should we move everybody out of an area that is less prone to flooding, or should we work on flood resistant sanitation? Before I hand these comments to Mintje and Jens again, I would like to say we have about 60% to 80% of the global population living in coastal cities. Looking at sea level rise and the changes in climate, that would mean we would have to resettle, I don't know how many millions of people, because the flooding problem is not a problem of slums or like encroachment in rivers. That this is going to be a problem we will have in Miami, in small island states, everywhere around the world. And you cannot resettle, I guess, the whole of New York, which was totally underwater, and we have seen it a few years ago, as a lot of other cities. So I guess the question, there is no question that we have to protect the sanitation system, that we have to make them better, and that we have to think about how we are going to do that to protect people that live in cities, but also to ensure people who live in cities a better life. And this is my answer to that. And I'm sorry that I took advantage of being able to speak at the moment. However, I would like to give Mintje the word. Do you have any additions to these two questions? Because otherwise I would like to pose another question to you, which is in the chat. But I also want to give you the chance to say why urban and not rural, or is there a need to also look at rural, and do we really need flood resistant sanitation or not? And Jens, I would also like to hear your perspective on that, because you were actually talking about that in Santa Cruz. So if you could share your views, that would be super. Mintje, first to you.
I mean, I think you already answered it, and I tried to also answer the urban question in the other chat.
Okay, I didn't do that, so I'm sorry.
I just did it actually at a similar time, I think, or just before you answered it. But I mean, basically, I was also saying the easiest answer would be, because GIZ wanted to do this together with the Resilient Cities Network. That would be an easy answer. But I mean, yeah, also the main fact that the majority of the world's population does live in urban areas, and it's expected to still increase. So that's why we decided to focus on that. And as cities are extremely vulnerable to a lot of shocks and stresses, and climate-related shocks and stresses. So for this study, that alone was enough to really look at. But I mean, of course, I think a lot of the learnings can definitely also be taken into other areas, and it would also be good to look at other areas as well, at more rural areas. But for us, this was the starting point to get the conversation going, basically, and to try and address the larger population currently. Yeah, I think for the other one, you already answered, Katrin. I'm happy to give that also to Jens. And the first question, I also already answered something in the chat, so I'm happy to also say something about that again, and also about the mitigation question afterwards.
Jens, any further comments from your side with regard to do we really need flood-resistant sanitation, or should we move people elsewhere? We can't hear you.
Okay, now microphone. Maybe first about the urban-rural question. I think in rural areas, the challenge is not only climate resilient sanitation, but coverage in general, because usually we see coverage rates in urban areas are much bigger. So I think in rural areas, the question really is how to connect people anyhow, either to centralized or decentralized systems. But I think the issue of climate resilient sanitation is much more urgent in the urban context, due to the density of how the people are living, and also there's due to this density, there's a much bigger pressure on the groundwater, for example, groundwater extraction, but then also the pollution of groundwater. So it's a matter of density, and regarding the question of moving people, I think it's simply not feasible. As I mentioned, in Santa Cruz, for example, there's an annual growth rate of 6%. So the city is growing and growing, and it's just not feasible to move people anyhow anywhere. It's rather to find an appropriate sanitation solution for the different parts of the city. So you have to look into, there's no sanitation solution for the entire city. So you have to check the feasibility for each part of the city, considering the different characteristics.
Yeah, and I think the important part here is also that it's not just sanitation. So we need to stop at looking at only at sanitation, or only at energy, or only at drainage, or only at water. We need to recognize that in the city context, everything is interconnected, and a failure on a sanitation system impacts the city in different ways, and health is one of them, but not the only one. The same you're seeing if the electricity system breaks down, which we have seen also in developed cities, where then the sanitation system breaks down as well. Or if you have storm surges because of hurricanes, your whole sanitation system, no matter if it's on-site, off-site, centralized or decentralized, is actually not functioning anymore. And that impacts a lot of different parts. And I think it increases the overall risk. So if we want to take the risk perspective. So Mintje, giving the question to you around the part is, we are talking about mitigation as a co-benefit in the study, and there's a background to that. So how can mitigation be a benefit and not a process? Could you answer that question?
I can try, and I'm happy if you want to add something to it, Katrin. So, I mean, when we talk about resilience and climate resilient sanitation systems, we are talking about, for example, increasing the resilience of on-site containments and of really having safely managed sanitation systems that withstand also climate events. And so that in turn, if we look at where most of the global greenhouse gas emissions come from, it's from usually unmanaged or mismanaged or unsafely managed sanitation systems. It's also from wastewater that is being discharged into the environment. It's so a lot of it is a systematic issue. And when we talk about we want to improve the resilience of sanitation systems and of service delivery and of all the parts that come with it, we see it as a co-benefit that then also this improvement will result in a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So that's why we talk about a co-benefit of what we are looking in a bigger picture to improve in a sanitation system. And when we also look at the topic of value from waste or how this can improve the overall resilience of a city in general, if we look at reusing parts of wastewater and sanitation, then again, it's a co-benefit from these reuse to then also being able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So that's kind of my attempt, but I'm happy for Katrin to also chip in.
No, I think it's totally right. Maybe just one comment on in general on why we are talking about co-benefits and not. So if you go back to the definition of resilience which we presented, so resilience means the capacity of something, either a person or a system or a city or an institution, to respond to if something happens to them or to it, and to actually this famous term of bouncing back. So you're trying to reduce the risk of failure of the system. That doesn't mean that you can always prevent it, but if it fails, you try to design a system in a way that it's actually going back to function very quickly. But if you think about planning for resilience or designing for resilience, you're not only thinking about how to do that to make sure that the system bounces back to actually be functional. And that can be an infrastructure, but that can also be a service. So there's another question in the chat that talks about existing services. So how do we make sure that an impact that is happening is actually not putting water and sanitation provision out of order for several days? How do we need to think about service provision, for example, in a way that we can deliver services even during a disaster? And that is the whole aspect we have been doing also in post-conflict states, about how can we ensure that the service can be provided at all times. So I think the part about the co-benefits is that you're actually designing a system not only for the intended impact, but also beyond. And that means that you're purposely thinking about how can I provide access to sanitation services? How can I provide access to these critical services, but do more than that? And you design for that purpose. And for a lot of us in the sanitation space, this is the whole eco-san conversation about closing the loop and making resourceful decisions. But within the context of climate, the climate discourse, we have to talk about adapting, responding to climate shocks. But we also need to think about what is our role in the sanitation sector to actually mitigate that, and how can we design systems purposefully and plan for it, even if it's an existing service in our existing system. That is a lot of the conversations around retrofitting, for example, to actually mitigate and mitigates reduce greenhouse gas emissions and so on. And I think as a sanitation engineer, we today have an obligation to think about how we are not only thinking about the toilet and the sewer and the treatment plant or the septic tank or whatever. We need to think about how the system interacts with other systems, where it's being built, and how we can make sure that it's functioning at all times, people are protected, but also how we can use the systems to make cities more livable, to make cities, to future-proof cities, to actually allow cities to address multiple problems they have at the same time. Because a mayor at every single stage will decide, am I putting my money into sanitation or into drainage or into housing? If we can make the point that this person has to budget for sanitation, because it also helps with other problems the city faces, we will increase also the amount of money which is going there, and we will allow sanitation and decision making to move up the ladder. Jens, I'm giving the word to you, please. What is your perception on climate impact on existing services? How should we deal with that? We are not building everything from scratch. How do we as sanitation poo enthusiasts or sanitation engineers are dealing with the situation that we are not only building new systems, but also look at existing systems?
Katrin, sorry, I think I didn't get the question.
Okay, so the question is, so we are not only building new sanitation systems, and climate change is happening. So what are we doing with the existing systems, and how do we actually create an enabling environment in cities that allows us to focus on existing systems and climate proof them, but also how do we deal with new systems in future?
Well, difficult. I'm not very sure what to answer. I mean, from infrastructure perspective, I think it's difficult to retrofit existing systems. Now, maybe in parts of the city where they have latrines or poor flushed latrines, they could be somehow improved by rising them to avoid flooding or to prevent flooding. But maybe I think overworking infrastructure-wise might be difficult. Maybe, I don't know, maybe the operation maintenance schemes could be improved. So maybe it's not only about infrastructure, but about the management procedures. But well, don't have a very much better answer than that at the moment.
How can you say that was not a good answer? I think it was a perfect answer. We should delete the last part about if that is not the right answer. I think it's absolutely, you made a really important point, and I think this is something I would really like to reiterate. Resilience and climate adaptation or climate mitigation is not only about infrastructure, it's about the people who are operating them. That is the link between service provision. To make services more resilient, you need to think about who is operating them, how are we operating, how are we dealing with contingency planning as an absolute critical part. And that is, if we are talking about climate-related shocks and stresses, but we could also talk about civil war. So how do we actually make sure that the sanitation system functions if whatever is going to happen? And I see that there are a number of people in this group today who know what I'm talking about, because we tried to build sanitation system in South Sudan after the war. So I would like to take a break here, and I'm going to ask Luciana to share one of the next slides. I have seen a couple of questions. I would really like to hear your view on why do you think that sanitation initiatives, like the stuff we all duly care about, are rarely considered climate actions. So why are we only hearing about water in the climate discourse? Do you have any perception on that? Why this is the case? What do we need to change to make sure that sanitation is considered an essential part of climate action? Or do you actually believe it's not part of it at all? So do you have any perceptions? Please share with us. I see that the word silo. So my assumption is that that we as sanitation practitioners and poo enthusiasts are working in silos. So we are not talking to the climate people, or guidance. So even if we want to work, even if we want to work on climate, we have no idea how to do so. We know how to build toilets and wastewater treatment plants, but we don't know how to design climate actions. There's a lack of solutions. Sanitation, the sanitation profile is not, I totally agree. People don't like to talk about sanitation outside this wash bubble you're in. It's complex, yes, it is. Only complex systems can build resilience. So yes, sanitation systems are complex, but that also allows us to think about resilience. Education, that's true. The link between sanitation and climate change is not made. I haven't seen any kind of courses on that, but I also know that Barbara Evans was part of this conference, so she may be the right person to address to that. So how do we get the interlinkage into the academia more specifically? We have a lack of data. Yes, that's true, but a lot of people are trying to sort that now. We have a knowledge gap. We need training. Yes, we need to build capacity around how sanitation initiatives need to be planned and designed to accommodate climate considerations. That is homework we need to do. Luciana, can you get us into the next question before we are closing the sessions? So what are the opportunities you see for sanitation in the conversation around climate change? Is there a place for us in that? What are the opportunities we are missing? What are the opportunities we need to look out for? Not a single answer. So we are remaining in our silo. We are not dealing with these climate people. Mintje, it's going to be really nice for us. That means we can stop the conversation around COP26. We don't need to have the session there if the sanitation people can't make a change. So water safety, exactly. Yes, that's it. That's it. Yes. Is there more? Drainage, yes. Come on, guys. Why do we need to be in the climate conversation? We are sanitation people. What are the opportunities your passion has to address one of the biggest challenges that is ahead of us? Now we need to adapt infrastructure. By the way, 75% of the infrastructure in cities we need in 2050 has not been built. There are a lot of toilets to be built in the next 20 years, guys. Mitigation, yeah. Silver brown bullet, I love that. We are going to take that to COP, Mintje, definitely. Solutions, mitigation, water sanitation, innovation, yes. Although innovation is also not the solution for everything. Sustainable development, yes, we need to make the link between reducing risks, building resilience, and the sustainable development and SDG 6 in all the work we are doing. SDG 11, SDG 6 together, that is the work we need to do. Wonderful. And a final question before we are closing. Who needs to sit on the table? So like, I assume we are quite a homogeneous group, maybe. We are all passionate about the sanitation. We all know that we need to do much more moving forward. Who, if we want to marry sanitation and climate, who needs to sit at the wash table besides us? Like, who do we need to talk to? How do we make sure that we are not only talking to ourselves? Yeah, I also agree that definitely the Pope has an important role to play because he is a champion. We need to use him. Let him talk about sanitation. That would be an amazing achievement. Super woman is also coming up, but I guess people like financing institutions more. I think, yes, we need money. We need to talk to them. They need to understand that money that now moves to climate adaptation and mitigation needs to move into sanitation. There is a huge opportunity. Sanitation is not considered in the financing discussion around climate adaptation. It needs to go there for us to get more money to provide people with sustainable access. We need to talk to the local communities. We need to talk to governments. We need to find the right solutions. We have seen that in the slide before. So I talked a lot, as usual. I tend to do that. I appreciate your participation in that. I really, really hope that everybody in this conversation now actually is a pool enthusiast, even if you did not say that you were one. I really hope that you are going to do as amazing work as Jens is doing in Bolivia. And I really hope that you're going to support Mintje and her team, who continue this amazing work around climate and sanitation, and how do we make a solid couple out of the two rather than a divorced one. And if you have any further questions, comments, please reach out to us. We are happy to have continuous conversation, and thank you so much for spending your lunchtime with us. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Katrin. Great moderation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. At least nobody unmuted me. So Anna, thank you. And thank you to everybody on this call. Luciana, thank you so much for running the slides.